The half-god strategy. The half-god strategies. The half-god's covert strategy. The half-god's covert strategies. The half-god's overt strategy. The half-god's overt strategies. The half-god's indirect strategy. The half-god's indirect strategies. The half-god's direct strategy. The half-god's direct strategies. The half-god's slow-paced strategy. The half-god's slow-paced strategies. The half-god's fast-paced strategy. The half-god's fast-paced strategies. The half-god's soft strategy. The half-god's soft strategies. The half-god's firm strategy. The half-god's firm strategies. The half-god's hard strategy. The half-god's hard strategies. The half-god's beginning strategy. The half-god's beginning strategies. The half-god's middling strategy. The half-god's middling strategies. The half-god's ending strategy. The half-god's ending strategies. The half-god's basic strategy. The half-god's basic strategies. The half-god's intermediate strategy. The half-god's intermediate strategies. The half-god's advanced strategy. The half-god's advanced strategies. The half-god's private strategy. The half-god's private strategies. The half-god's public strategy. The half-god's public strategies. The half-god's silent strategy. The half-god's silent strategies. The half-god's written strategy. The half-god's written strategies. The half-god's photo strategy. The half-god's photo strategies. The half-god's audio strategy. The half-god's audio strategies. The half-god's video strategy. The half-god's video strategies. The half-god's past strategy. The half-god's past strategies. The half-god's present strategy. The half-god's present strategies. The half-god's future strategy. The half-god's future strategies.